Somewhere inside Sandringham House, there is a document that could decide the future of the British monarchy, and by law, none of us will ever be allowed to read it. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a fact. Under a 1993 legal agreement, the private wills of British monarchs are automatically sealed from public view for a minimum of 90 years. 90 years, long after every person watching this video is gone. The true contents of King Charles's private estate arrangements will still be locked away from Parliament, from tax authorities, and from us. So when royal watchers say something is happening behind those walls right now, a quiet restructuring of who inherits what, nobody can actually confirm it, but nobody can rule it out either. And that gap between what's legally hidden and what insiders whisper is exactly where this story lives. Before we get into it, if you're into royal deep dives that separate the real documented history from the rumor mill, hit subscribe to Crown Watch. This one's got a lot of both, and I want you here for what happens next. Let's start with what's actually true, because the real legal architecture here is stranger than most fiction. The King's private properties, places like Balmoral and Sandringham, are not Crown assets. They don't belong to the state, and they don't automatically pass to the next monarch the way the throne does. They're personal property, owned outright by whoever is reigning, worth an estimated several £100 million combined. That means Charles has real, personal, legal discretion over what happens to them. Discretion no king before the modern era ever had to exercise under this much public scrutiny. Layer onto that the Duchy of Lancaster, the private estate that's funded the sovereign's personal income since the reign of Queen Victoria, deliberately structured to stay independent of Parliament. And layer onto that the fact that Queen Elizabeth II, before her death, was known to have made specific provisions in her own will regarding family jewellery and personal effects, provisions we know exist because their existence was confirmed in a 2022 UK court ruling that sealed the contents but acknowledged the document. We know the box exists, we're just not allowed to open it. That's the real foundation. Everything from here forward is what people close to royal finance circles have speculated might be happening inside that foundation, and I want to be upfront with you the whole way through about what's confirmed and what's rumour. So here's the speculation that's been circulating. Royal commentators who track the palace's financial disclosures have noted something curious over the past year. A handful of unusual gaps and adjustments in the estate's published accounts, changes some analysts believe are consistent with a reallocation of personal assets. Nothing improper has ever been alleged by any credible source, and the palace has never commented on internal estate planning, as is standard practice. But the pattern has been enough to get royal finance writers speculating that Charles may be using his personal legal authority while he's still alive and reigning to lock certain decisions into place before they'd otherwise fall to his successor. Why would a king do that? Royal historians point to something Charles has said publicly, if elliptically for years. His stated priority is protecting the institution over any individual member of it. If that's true, it would make sense, in theory, for him to want key financial decisions settled on his own terms, while he has the authority to make them, rather than leaving them to be fought over after he's gone. There's a name that keeps coming up when royal finance watchers talk about this: the Duchy of Lancaster's Board of Trustees, formerly called the Chancellor of the Duchy. This is a real, publicly known cabinet-level position, currently a government minister. And it exists specifically because the sovereign's private estate is so large and so old that it needs professional oversight, even though it technically answers to nobody but the king. That single fact tells you something important. Even Britain's government has decided this money needs careful, quiet handling. When people speculate about restructuring happening behind closed doors, they're really talking about decisions moving through this small, permanent, professionalized layer of trustees and lawyers who've managed royal wealth for decades and who almost never speak to the press. If something is shifting, it's shifting through people whose entire job is discretion. That's part of why so little ever leaks. The Duchy publishes an annual report. It's public. You can read the top-line revenue figures yourself, but the report tells you almost nothing about internal succession planning. Royal watchers pore over those numbers every year looking for anomalies: an unusual land sale, a change in reported reserves, a shift in how income is categorized. Analysts have flagged real documented fluctuations over the past few years, though the palace's explanation has always been mundane: investment performance, property market changes, routine reallocation. Whether that's the whole story or a convenient cover for something bigger is exactly the kind of question nobody outside that trustee circle can actually answer. Now let's talk about William, because this is where the family dynamics get genuinely interesting and where I want to be really careful about what's documented versus what's guesswork. What's documented: William's household and the King's household are legally and administratively separate. The Duchy of Cornwall, William's income source as Prince of Wales, operates independently from the Duchy of Lancaster, which funds Charles. Historically, when a large asset moves between these structures, it requires formal legal process. And that process has, at points in royal history, created friction between reigning monarchs and their heirs. This isn't new. Edward VII and his mother famously clashed for decades over exactly this kind of thing: money, timing, and who controls what, while the old monarch is still alive. So when royal watchers speculate about tension between Charles and William over estate matters, they're not inventing a new phenomenon. They're pointing at one of the oldest patterns in this family's history and asking whether it's playing out again. What we don't have is any confirmed account of a specific dispute, a specific document, or a specific disagreement between the two men. What we have is pattern matching from people who study this institution for a living, watching for the kinds of signals, staffing changes, unusual timing in announcements, those subtle shifts in how the two households talk about long-term planning that have preceded real rifts in the past. Now, the part of this story that gets the most attention online, Harry. Here's what's actually on the record. Prince Harry's personal finances were affected when he and Meghan stepped back from royal duties in 2020. Buckingham Palace confirmed at the time that the couple would no longer receive public funding, and reporting from multiple outlets, not just tabloids, but outlets like the BBC, indicated that Harry continued for a period to receive private funding directly from Charles before that arrangement was reported to have been wound down. Harry himself has spoken publicly in his memoir and in interviews about feeling financially cut off and about tension with his father and brother over exactly these kinds of provisions. So the emotional core of this, a son who felt the money and the family structure were used against him, isn't speculation. Harry has said it himself, in his own words, on the record. What is speculation is the specific mechanism. Online, you'll see claims about specific trusts, specific clauses, specific inheritance items tied to specific dates, the kind of detail that sounds authoritative because it's so precise. Royal finance experts are generally skeptical of these claims for a simple reason. This level of granular detail about a sealed, private legal document simply isn't something anyone outside a tiny circle of estate lawyers would have access to. When you see a claim that's specific about a document nobody is legally allowed to see, that specificity should make you more skeptical, not less. Here's a useful rule of thumb royal correspondents actually use. The more cinematic a claim sounds, secret couriers, biometric lockouts, hardware kill switches, the less likely it reflects how this institution actually operates. The real royal legal apparatus is slow, boring, and procedural, almost to a fault. Multiple confirmed accounts from former palace staff describe an institution obsessed with paperwork, precedent, and process, not one that improvises dramatic countermeasures on a rainy Tuesday. That doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means whatever is happening almost certainly looks like meetings, memos, and quiet legal drafting spread across months, not a single dramatic afternoon. What's more grounded, because it comes from documented history rather than invented mechanics, is the question of family jewellery and heirlooms. This is an area where the palace has, at points, been notably quiet, and where past disputes are actually documented. There is real historical precedent for royal jewellery ownership disputes, pieces whose provenance and rightful ownership have been debated by historians and even occasionally litigated. Diana's personal jewellery, in particular, has long been a subject of public fascination, partly because Diana herself was known to want specific pieces to go to her sons, and eventually their children. Whether that wish is legally binding on the current king is genuinely unclear, and royal watchers have speculated for years about whether jewelry meant for Diana's grandchildren could, under current custodianship, end up reclassified as part of the official crown collection rather than passed down privately. Nobody has confirmed this is happening, but the underlying legal ambiguity, personal gift versus state property, is real, and it's exactly the kind of grey area that tends to cause quiet family friction in institutions like this one. There's also a broader historical pattern worth putting on the table because it reframes everything. This family has never actually been good at handling inheritance. Edward VIII's abdication in 1936 triggered a genuine financial standoff with his brother George VI over money and property that took years to fully resolve, much of it conducted through lawyers and intermediaries because the two men could barely stand to discuss it directly. Queen Victoria's will famously caused friction among her 9 children for years after her death. Even Elizabeth II's own inheritance from her father involved complex, carefully managed legal steps that took time to settle. If you zoom out far enough, what royal watchers are speculating about right now isn't an aberration. It's this family doing what it has always done at moments of succession, quietly, legally, and privately fighting about money while presenting total unity to the public. That gap between public unity and private friction is, frankly, the entire business model of the institution. The monarchy's continued public support depends heavily on the image of a stable, harmonious family carrying out a stable, harmonious transition of power. Any real tension over inheritance, even mundane procedural tension, is something the palace has every incentive to keep completely out of view, regardless of whether anything dramatic is actually happening. That incentive alone is enough to explain the secrecy without needing to invent a specific plot to justify it. So where does that leave us? Strip away the invented specifics, the secret couriers, the dramatic lockouts, the documents nobody could possibly have seen. And what's left is something quieter and honestly more believable, an aging monarch with real legal authority over a genuinely enormous private fortune, a documented history of friction between sovereigns and their heirs over exactly this kind of money, a son who has said publicly and repeatedly that he felt financially and emotionally cut off, and a set of family heirlooms whose ownership has always existed in a legal grey zone that nobody outside the family has ever been allowed to fully see. You don't need a conspiracy to explain why that combination produces tension. You just need to understand how much money is involved, how few people are allowed to see the paperwork, and how long this particular family has been quietly fighting about inheritance behind closed doors, going back generations, long before Charles or William or Harry were the names in the headlines. The honest answer is, we don't know what's in that sealed will, and by law we won't know for 90 years. Everything else, every dramatic claim about secret signings and locked-out princes and disinherited grandchildren, is speculation dressed up as certainty, and it's worth staying skeptical of anyone who tells you they know exactly what's inside a document that legally nobody outside a tiny circle is allowed to read. What we can say with confidence is this: the structure of royal wealth practically guarantees this kind of quiet tension, personal fortune, sealed documents, an heir waiting decades for authority he can see but not yet touch. That's not a modern scandal. That's just what happens when you build an institution this old around this much unaccountable private money. It's also worth remembering that William himself will eventually face the exact same problem in reverse. Whatever arrangements Charles makes now, William will one day be the one holding sealed documents, managing a fortune the public can't audit, and deciding what his own children can and can't know until he's gone. The cycle doesn't resolve with this generation. If anything, every unanswered question about Charles's private will is really a preview of the same questions royal watchers will be asking about William and then about George, for as long as this institution keeps its finances legally shielded from public view. Whatever is actually written on that vellum in Sandringham's dispatch box, one thing is certain: we're not going to find out anytime soon. And maybe that's the most telling detail in this entire story, not what's being hidden, but the fact that hiding it is completely unremarkably legal. If you want to go deeper into the real documented history of royal inheritance disputes, the Edward VII fights, the sealed will precedents, the actual court rulings that shaped what the palace can and can't keep secret, let me know in the comments and hit subscribe so you don't miss it when we go there.